So welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for being here. Um, Anything but ordinary time. And you have decided to use this time to have a conversation with each other and with me on this topic on the pedagogy of Sabbath. Now, APSI has made available a series of very attractive topics to address. And you choose to make this topic a topic of reflection today. And I would like to know why this subject matter you want to consider at this time, this Sabbath in the busyness of life. It is clear, and you know this, that the way we engage a learning experience depends on the expectations that you bring to it and how those expectations will find connections to my presentation and also to your own reflections. So I will invite you at this moment to go to the chat and briefly share why is about this theme of interest to you at this moment. You can look at the bubble icon and then share some of those comments. I will be reading some of your responses. Why is this a topic you're interested to hear about today? Okay, great. Looking to deepen my understanding and the practice of Sabbath. That's good. Finding ways to hold Sabbath holy for families who have to worship over Zoom. I keep looking for the Sabbath. All of us are. Don't feel like I have any Sabbath time. Good. I'm a spiritual director, and I'm always interested in studying Sabbath for myself and those who I direct. We all need to work on Sabbath. Keeping Sabbath is a mandate for us, yet so hard to incorporate in our daily routines. That's true. Let's talk about that. Keeping Sabbath is a mandate for us, just so hard to incorporate into our daily, weekly lives. That's a good dichotomy there. It's a mandate, something we have to do, but we cannot do. How do you address that paradox? It's hard to find time. All of the above. I think we hear all the time, I'm too busy. How will fit Sabbath into my busy lives? I feel like we need Sabbath more than ever because of all the stresses we're facing in life. I continue to struggle with how to carve Sabbath time. I value Sabbath and encourage others to practice it. Good. My ministry, Place of Grace, is centered on creating Sabbath spaces for individuals, couples, small groups. Okay. Great. Somebody says he has or she has Elizabeth, she has a healthy Sabbath practice until she took a new call 4 years ago. Now I have none. Okay. I think I need to renew myself and my spirit. We need some intentional Sabbath time. This is a great list. This is a great list. So I think that in the next 10 hours that we will be together in this workshop, we will be able to address those particular concerns and needs. Oh, wait a second, we only have 1 hour. I'm sorry. So that means that we may need to be a little bit more concise, more realistic about what we can accomplish and hopefully address some of those concerns, or at least give you some food for thought. So as you move forward, you can start exploring how you address some of those questions. And as always, I will be available after this workshop. I'm going to offer you my contact information so that you can contact me if you want to continue a conversation. But for the sake of time, these are my goals for today. I would like to generate new awareness on the role of the Sabbath and Sabbath practices in the faith formation process. I want to bring Sabbath to the forefront. Sabbath has always been a component of our faith, but I just want to see if we have to make it more essential. as part of our Christian practices and Christian identity. The second goal will be to explore biblical foundations of the Sabbath from new hermeneutical keys. All of us are familiar with texts or the texts that refer to Sabbath. How can we read them in a different way? Let's see if we can find some clues to new readings of these texts. And the third goal will be to identify ways a Sabbath practice can be both envisioned and engage amid contemporary fast-paced culture. Is Sabbath, I hope that at the end of this hour, we at least can consider how the Sabbath can challenge the ways we consume time, the pace of our movements, which are often guided by what I call object saturation, which means we have more artifacts to handle while completing a single task. Technology, while has been created to simplify our lives, has pushed us into new forms of work and leisure because we have many artifacts to accomplish single goals. We call that sometimes multitasking. We live in a cycle of production and acquisition of those objects. And that acquisition is not only material, it's not only that we seek to find the best things, the best tools to do our work, but we also want some sort of emotional acquisition. We want to receive affirmation. We want to acquire affirmation from others. We yearn for likes in social media forums. And we seek for recognition. So let's see how we can challenge with Sabbath this culture of acquisition, the thing that in order to be more, we have to have more, both materially and effectively. So if we agree with these goals, I think we can move forward. So I will start with a claim that may sound hyperbolic, and I understand that. So listen to it, and then we can explore why I'm making this claim. And I would say that among the many components of faith, we are to encourage in others and experience ourselves, the most important faith expression to be nurtured by Christians today is the teaching and the keeping of the Sabbath. Now, let me stress, without fear of engaging a debate, the most important. It's not an important, it's not something we should seek to do, but as we read the reality, as we look at what our life is requiring from us and from others, I would say this may be the most important Christian practice that we have to start to have conversations about. So my intention in the next hour is to convince you that this is not a grandiose homiletical claim just because it preaches well, but it is at the cross where our faith as Christians in this culture is constantly tested and proven in our use of time. Now, this may sound like an overstatement. Well, we have taught about Sabbath as part of the Hebrew Christian tradition, and some of you have said in your comments that you keep it, that you teach about it. I know that at times we have emphasized the importance of rest and the cultivation of self-care and our relationship with God. Sabbath has primarily been, for the Christian tradition, a personal choice, a vestige of an old tradition that do not accommodate easily in our contemporary lifestyles. Again, in your comments, you have recognized this reality. That is something we should do, but something that is difficult to engage. Perhaps an indulgence for those who can afford to practice it. And if it's an indulgence for those who can afford it, it may be also the Sabbath will be one of those components of what we call social cultural privilege. And as such, it also has to be analyzed. Sabbath may be considered that secondary, ancillary thing that Christians can do whenever that which is essential, which is mission, work, worship, community building, service, whenever those things are done, and it opens a space, an unexpected space for a pause, then we can take the Sabbath. So it's ancillary in our understanding to this which is essential. So now that I have made that claim, to assess if Sabbath is in fact considered a discretionary component of our faith experience, I want to ask you the following questions, and feel free to answer in the chat to these questions. How many times during the last year was Sabbath a topic of conversation in your congregations, so that your members can understand what it means and how to take advantage of that gift of time? Okay. Good. Try to look here for a second. Okay. What about the last 3 years? How many times and what depth is Sabbath a subject matter in church school curriculum? How many Sundays we dedicate to Sabbath in comparison to the Sundays we dedicate to, let's say, stewardship? In what cycle of the liturgical year is there a lectionary emphasis on Sabbath? In fact, for those of us who work in ministry, when it comes to liturgical celebrations like Advent, Lent, Pentecost, those are probably the less, the places in our life together where we can find less time for Sabbath. So how is Sabbath integrated to that cycle of the church life? So in maintaining the essentiality, the centrality of Sabbath in the faith formation process, we are not only today as Christians distant from the Hebrew Christian tradition depicted in the sacred texts, but we are even distant from our own foundational American religious tradition. Perhaps this is the reason why some of us do not see it as essential, because it's an old tradition, probably a residual of American pietism. Those people who came here and make this keeping the Sabbath a rule. Well, let me tell you, one guy who was not really a Puritan. Let's see if I can move this. Trying to move my PowerPoint and it's not doing it, so let me try again. Oh, good. Abraham Lincoln, I like this quote from him because it shows how seriously actually he took this idea of the Sabbath. He said, as we keep or break the Sabbath day, we nobly save or mainly lose the last best hope by which humanity rises. That's actually a claim, I would say, more encompassing than the one that I shared before. We lost the hope by which humanity rises when we break the Sabbath. Now, we are Presbyterians. We don't take lessons from politicians. Hopefully, we take lessons from Scripture. So let's review briefly the scriptural witness to find some clues to Sabbath, or how we should look at this from a new hermeneutical or interpretative lens. And the first time the word Sabbath appears, or at least a reference of a day of rest, is in the story of creation. You have read this many times. And the heaven and the earth were finished, and all of the work in them. Let me move this so I'm sorry, so I can read. And all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day, God finished God's work which God had made, and God rested on the seventh day from all God's work which God had made. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because that in it God rested from all work which God in creating had made. So I want to highlight that this text introduces in the biblical narrative for the first time the concept of the holy. It is the first mention in the scriptural witness that something is sacred. While God appears as the first character in the story, or depending on who reads the story, you can say the second, because chaos may be the first one. Nothing is holy, even in creation, until Sabbath is mentioned. Everything that is created before God rests is simply tov, is good, is sufficient, is complete, doesn't need anything to be added to it. So because there's no need to go back to creation, to the objects that were created for some sort of improvement, or to add new products to creation, or to increase efficacy, God ceases that organization of space and that occupation of space with things or with beings. And when that ceases, then Sabbath comes as holy. And the interesting thing is that rabbinical interpreters say that God creates also the Sabbath. That means that while we think that creation ends on the sixth day, and then Sabbath comes, some rabbinical literature will suggest, no, the creation of space and its objects is complete and is good, and then God creates on the seventh day the Sabbath as holy time. So the Sabbath is part of that creation. It is rational and intentional so that people who labor can have rest. So rest is not available before this creation. Everything is chaos and anxiety. God is not returning to something that was before. God is making in this story a new time for people to rest and contemplate. And it is also important to notice that Sabbath serves as a bridge for two stories of creation. This is the first verse of chapter 2, but it's really the end of the story in chapter 1 of creation. And then comes the second story of creation, where the author gives us more detail on how humans are created. And in this story of creation, there's something for the first time that in the experience of creation is considered not to be good. I don't know if you can recall what that is. If somebody can open their mic and say, what was not good in the second story of creation? Any?
What was so good in the second story of creation?
What wasn't considered good in the second story of creation?
The tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Okay, may have a component, but really when they use the concept lo tov, not good, the thing that was not good was that the human person who was created was alone. It's not good, lo tov, for the human person, in this case, the man, to be by himself. So the Sabbath is placed in this narrative, interestingly, as a bridge from our relationship with the creative God and our relationship with others, between being in a reality that is plentiful and we can enjoy, and our need to establish a relationship with God, with creation, and with others. So the first principle of Sabbath, according to the biblical text, if we are reading this way, is that God values space. It's good, but God sanctifies time. And this is going to be important to consider later. Why is that we don't find time to practice Sabbath? Because perhaps we also value space above the use of time and everything that occupies that space. So the Sabbath then becomes synonymous with imposition and regulation when we come to the next story where we see the Sabbath mentioned. This is the story of the Exodus test where Moses is delivering God's commandments to the people of Israel. And imposition and regulation is something that we modern people resist. But here, this rule says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. So it's already holy. God made it holy. Keep it holy. Whoops. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is Sabbath to the Lord your God. Now the text by itself is innocuous. You can print it in a Hallmark card and have the same effect. But in the context of the whole system of laws in the commandments, it's a powerful and radical invitation in the context of a new relationship between God and his people or her people. There were matters Israelites knew very well from experience. They knew what it was to bow down to other gods because they were forced to do so. So they understood the first commandments. They knew how does it feel to be abandoned by God in the midst of an oppressive system. They knew violence. They knew they survived at times by stealing and how the Egyptian commodifying system of overproduction was killing them and placing them once or putting them once against the other in competition for scarce resources. But the only thing they haven't experienced in that relation with the Egyptian, their Egyptian experience, the only thing they have not known close was a time of rest. As slaves, their life was defined by labor. So all other things in those commandments, they can really relate to and understand why they were asked to do. But now there's this new liberating force that says, for you now, under a relationship with this God of Israel, you have to rest from that labor. Can you imagine how liberating that will be? So the radical invitation to rest was perceived because those who listened did not look at the commandments as a checking list, but they look at the commandments as a whole. Each commandment was weaved to each other and to their own experience. So the God who is claiming exclusivity in this case, don't bow before other gods, don't worship other gods, does that because wants to convey that it's a God that is not similar to the gods of the Egyptians, who are just satisfied by being placed in big buildings in continuous projects and improvements that enslave you. It's not a God that necessitates incessant and ostentatious worship, but mainly is a God of rest. If you rest and pay attention to your relationship with your God, you can break this system of labor, production, and competition that was part of your old life. Therefore, you will find no need to steal, to covet, to incur in violence against others, to kill. So in that tapestry, Sabbath is again a bridge. It's at the center of these commandments that allows us to experience a sound relationship with God. And as you can see, the first commandments are basically focusing on the relationship of the people of Israel with God. And after the Sabbath, starts to focus on the relationship of the people of God with others. Starting with the family circle, to the neighbors, to the larger communities. So all the negations of life that we see in do not do this, do not do that, do not do this, cease to do this, all those negations of life become an affirmation in the Sabbath, where there's nothing there that says don't do this. Just say keep the Sabbath. It's an affirmation. So the gods of the Egyptians' life experience thrive on people's scarcity. There's wealth, but that wealth thrives when other people think they need and that there's no sufficient, because they will work hard to get it. The feeling of needing more because it's never enough. But the God of Israel that is promised in this Sabbath is abundant. There is always enough. We can dare to rest. So the second principle of the Sabbath is God's sufficiency creates the conditions for the restoring of life. And sometimes, and I ask many people who are in ministry at times when they feel anxious and say, I don't find any time because I have to do this, this, and that. And I ask, my first question is, and who is expecting that from you? I would say that the majority of the time, certainly, people are asking for it. But for people of vocation, committed people of vocation, it's actually yourself putting those expectations. Because probably you consider that things are never enough. So this is why probably, let me show you two quotes I found that address in a different way those two principles. In terms of time, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote one of the classic books on Sabbath, and that's the title, Sabbath, he said that what we plead against in Sabbath is the human's conditional surrender to space, our enslavement to things. We must not forget that it's not a thing that lends significance to a moment, but a moment that lends significance to a thing. So things and spaces are challenged by the Sabbath to ask us to refocus on the value of time and the use of time. Walter Brueggemann, who also wrote a book on Sabbath as resistance, referring to scarcity and the way we see God as providing, but always feeling that it's never enough, he will say, God invites those at Sinai to a new life of neighborly freedom in which Sabbath is the cornerstone of faithful freedom. Such faithful practice of work stoppage is radical. It declares in bodily ways that we will not participate in the anxiety system that pervades our social environment. So although it's embedded with commandments, it is important to recognize that what it implies is freedom. Freedom from that system that in some way pushes to violate every other commandment, if possible. And this is why Sabbath is so difficult for us to really engage profoundly, because we prefer to touch it or treat it as tangential. And we prefer that because it's completely countercultural. In fact, it's one of the most countercultural things Christians can do in this society to express their unique identity. None of the other commandments actually works the same way, because all the other commandments are already embedded in our culture. Even our Constitution gives us some right to worship and to worship our God. Not killing, not stealing, that has been legalized. It has been coded in legislation. But Sabbath, that culture pushes away. We are not expected to encourage people to take time for rest, but on the contrary, to occupy every space of our lives with action and labor, because there's scarcity of things and of time. So in Sabbath, we resist these cultural appreciations of time and want. So Sabbath is really the resistance to make time, which is a gift from God to frame our living and our relationship with God, a holy thing. We resist to subordinate that time to things, even if those things are good. Even if these things we consider to be important, we don't subordinate those to God's gift of time for rest. You all know we live in a culture of commodification where we want to use and abuse time with work to attain things, material and non-material things, at the expense of the enjoyment of God's gift of time. So, if this is going to be countercultural to these movements of society that require us to focus on space and things and activity and production and consumption, what we have to do then is to implement a pedagogy that is more focused on learning than unlearning. Because sometimes we put too much time when we teach Christian practices on how to do it, but in order to do it, we have to unlearn some assumptions we have about it. So it's a sort of a via negativa sort of pedagogy where we say the first thing we have to unlearn is that Sabbath is a traditional and optional practice that does not bear significantly on the identity and ethics of the faithful. We have to unlearn so that we can learn that this is not an optional component of faith, but a component of a holistic faith, as we have seen in the witness of the scripture. Dismissing the Sabbath as part of what we do as Christians is a form of impairing our faith development. It builds a spiritual deficiency. The second one, which is interesting, is that Sabbath can be substituted or reduced, especially in the more liberal Protestant tradition. It can be reduced to our dedicated day for expressing our faith within a worship space. People can say, I keep my Sabbath. I go to church on Sundays. But remember, we have already defined this as something that Sabbath centers on the gift of time and the holiness of time, not on space. And worship, really, saying that Sabbath can be replaced with just worship, it's centering on space and the objects that are on that space, not time. actually time becomes bothersome for many people. Who isn't looking at their watches when the sermon goes longer than 20 minutes? So time, if you are anxious about time, time ceases to be then that sort of opportunity to get away of anxiety, to enjoy your relationship with God. And honestly, worship is centered in work. Pastors' work, Christian educators' work, teachers' work, ushers' work. The concept of liturgy, liturgia, means the work of the people. So even if you are relaxed or rested as you worship, you are imposing work on others. So worship is centered, and it's good. Worship has its role, an important role in our tradition, but it cannot substitute Sabbath. Okay? It is so centered in work and labor that that one of the first responses with the COVID that we moved into was to say, because we cannot work together, because we cannot occupy the space, we close the churches. I was driving the other day and I found that some Buddhist centers never close. We're going to talk about that later. But because they understand what they do in that space differently in terms of how they occupy their time there. So let me see here. So, and the other one is Sabbath is a spiritual practice that renders personal benefits. Yes. When we look at practices that are personal, we tend to forget that they should have an impact in a larger community and those who live around us. So whether it may be good for yourself to practice Sabbath, there is a component of that Sabbath that connects you to the formation of a larger community, starting with your family, and then with your congregation, with your community. Sabbath should not impose anxieties. Your Sabbath should not impose anxieties in other people, or it ceases to be Sabbath. There is this interesting text in the book of Isaiah where, the festivity of the Sabbath, actually, which was preparing everything for Sabbath, putting, the priests and people bringing stuff. There was a moment in which the festivity was so labor intensive, the Sabbath itself, that God said, oh, this really bothers me and frustrates me. Okay? Because there's no enjoyment of time. So I have talked a lot, and this is about Sabbath. So let me do the following. Let's look at this text, scriptural text. Let me see if I find. And this is from the Message, the New Version of the Bible, and it's a very, recognizable text where we are asked to rest. If you're tired, to come to Jesus. So I'm going to read this, and let's think that rather than looking the text in your screen, that I'm writing the text with smoke, okay? As I read it. So that means the words will disappear at some time. Even if I write an O, it's going to diffuse in the air. So listen to this text. And then try to decide what words or phrases you want to remain before the text disappears. Which ones will be in your mind as stable features? Okay, is that clear? Basically, it's like what calls your attention and you want to retain in your mind, so you don't lose that concept. So let's start. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you will recover your life. I'll show you how to take a rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you will learn to live freely and lightly. Okay. So the text is gone, like the smoke. What can you remember? And unmute yourself and say it.
Learn the unforced rhythms of grace.
Great. Somebody else?
Keep company with me.
Yeah. Great. Somebody else?
Live freely and lightly.
Great. Somebody else?
Walk with me.
Yes.
Restored or new life.
Yes.
How to take a real rest.
Oh, real rest. Good. Great. Somebody else? Good. So probably some of us were caught by the same concepts. Some of them are relational, has to do with spending time with God. Others are about gaining some sort of rhythm in life. Let's talk then about the practical side of this. Meaning, if we take seriously the essentiality of the Sabbath, what can we do to start practicing what may be a performance, what I will call, of Sabbath moments in your life? Okay, so we have a certain the centrality, how we practice it. And this phrase, after reading some, I was caught also by this idea of learning the first rhythms of grace. So if you're talking about pedagogy, what is what we're learning when we're talking about Sabbath? Is this unforced rhythms of grace? It's not necessarily just a mandate that falls on us as a weight that we don't want to do, but we have to do it. Is this unforced rhythm of our lives, and where we find God in those rhythms? I have come to this conclusion that the objective of faith is to find moments where your heartbeat can match the heartbeat of God. And you will say, that sounds good, but how do we know what the rhythms of God's heartbeats is? Sometimes preachers have these wonderful images and metaphors, but how do you concretize those? So the rhythms of God's grace, if we find importance in the idea of Sabbath as a component of creation, the rhythms of God's grace is measured by the systolic and diastolic movements of everything that breathes in nature. It is important for us to be attentive to something that has not been dominated by the idea of scarcity, by the idea of production, but that follows its own way of living, and that's nature. The other day, I have this, the pastor was preaching and he brought a toy like this. I don't know if you have seen it before. And this toy I use because it does kind of remind me here of this diastolic and systolic movement of a heartbeat. It expands, it collapses. Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic French theologian, spoke about the universe as a movement towards this collapsing in one. And we always find God in these moments where we just contract before we expand. Our lives focus on production, consumption, work, labor, is always ever expanding, and sometimes it breaks. That's when we feel the weight of not taking a rest. When our expansion is whole, continue to expand to the point of breaking and fracturing ourselves. So look at that movement that we see in almost everything in creation of expansion and contraction. And I give you some ideas. For example, the formation of a star. It started with a cloud, expanded cloud and particles, called a nebula. Those things with heat come together, a star is shaped, and it starts again. Our lungs, constantly expanding and contracting. The sea, the ebb and the flow. The seasons, the summer and the winter. As you know that heat expands and the cold weather of winter contracts. Actually, the community itself contracts during the winter. You don't see as many people in the streets playing, people just contract. They just go into their own self, into their homes and so on. So that's the movement of nature that Sabbath tries to help us get into. Now, this is interesting, and this is what I like this sort of movement. When we contract, when we find those moments where we can just stop, disrupt the busyness of life and say like, no, I have to stop. And we go back to work, this is not really a moment to recharge batteries to continue to do the work we were doing before. The experience of Sabbath should allow us, when we expand, to expand differently. You know that when we breathe, the air that comes out have different particles every time that we breathe. What we get in has different. The stars are different, even when they go through the same process. So a star expands, gets into a nebula, contracts, and there's a new star. Waves, when they go, they come back, they have different forms. Sometimes they just, touch our feet. Sometimes they just throw us out because they come with force. So this movement, and this is very important because when we talk about Sabbath, we look at Sabbath times as moments where we go back to get energy to do the same kind of labor, to continue to expand. Then we are focused again on the labor rather than on the gifts that we learn from that Sabbath, where we say, okay, what sort of transformation, even if it's not perceived by others, can I gain every time I disrupt intentionally my routine, this busyness? I decide to say, I'm going to stop, I'm going to rest, and I'm going to have a time with God. Some questions we can ask, what I call starting. How do we start? I'm changing these nouns to verbs. How do you start? If given an opportunity to retreat or pause, what new light can you bring forward? Now that you in ministry are retrieving and being in your space, creating new things, when you go back to the community, are you considering you're going to be the same educator, the same pastor? What new illuminations have you gained from this experience that you will bring back? It shows that the gift of time for yourself and to cultivate your relation with God has in fact changed you in some way. Waving, being a wave. If you retreat and pause, in what ways are you coming back to engage others? Your habits, and they're going to be different now. The way you relate to others, the way you speak to others. Seasoning, I like this one, seasoning. You know that if the world lost its salt, we are called to season. But here we're talking about the seasons of time. How will my faith use the liturgical seasons of the church as restful times to reimagine my work and relations? Those moments that are supposed to be moments of close relationship with God. How can I take, and it's going to be work for many of us, how we create disruptions on that work to really make meaning for ourselves about what those seasons mean for us. And the last one, which is breathing. What things may I take in to continue forging my faith, and which ones should be exuded? I have spent a lot of time with God lately in this basement where I'm working, saying what things are not essential anymore when I go back. Because we need to reconsider that. What things are just enough? Because I trust that whatever is lacking, God can provide. Heschel talks about, just to use an image, because some of us are more visual, talks about Sabbath as a palace in time. We run through time. We are at a fast pace to gain time. And he said, we have to stop. We have to find a palace. And I use the concept, or some other authors, of the cathedral in time. So Sabbath is our cathedral in time. The place we stop to get some sense of awe, and where we can actually spend some time with God. And we build those cathedrals in time. And I was saying before, like, for example, that our churches have closed because they're centered in space rather than time. Cathedrals are built, especially ancient cathedrals, with the idea of time. And every part of the architecture really wants to tell a story of time. And cathedrals are not there for worship, really. If they have a mass every month, that's by a bishop, that will be enough. Those of you who have traveled to places like Europe or Latin America know they're always open. Okay? No fear of contagion, because there may be only one person who is only stopping there to rest, to be in awe by all this grandiosity, and to connect to God. You know, my son, for example, he's going more to church now that is closed. Because on his way, he's studying in Florence, Italy. On his way to school, there's a cathedral that is open and he can stop by and spend 5 minutes or 10. I work in my first church that I work here in Philadelphia. I remember it was a church that was closed all day, only open on Sundays. It's a church that remains in the town that was gentrified. There were a lot of African Americans and African immigrants coming in, and only 5% of the people in that community were white, because they remained there after the closing of a factory 20 years ago. Now the church is Presbyterian, so the members are the 5% white people in the community. And the church is called the White Church because it's really white. It's painted all white, but also it's a metaphor for a church that is closed. And I remember the first thing that I did, I just realized there was a school in front of the school. You know, and I said, like, and I saw parents rushing in and going out. And one day I say, why don't I open the church in the morning for 1 hour? I stay there. I put a big sign, say, if you want to come in just to relax, to rest, you can come in. And let me tell you, we have homeless, we have parents. They will come one by one, but they will have their moment with God. And I think that changed their day. So anyhow, you will see I gave you 2 tools if you receive them. One is this expansion and contraction exercise that you can work with, which is like you can select one. We don't have time, unfortunately. This will be really a 90 minutes kind of workshop, so that I can give you some time to engage these exercises. But you can use the one on the waving, the starting, and then start to reflect on ways in which you can do that, in which you can find moments, okay, and to take a pause, an intentional pause to relate to God, not just a rest for the sake of rest, but a rest to be in relationship with God. And take note on how that changes you throughout the day. Now, some of you may say, well, I cannot have a full day, and the Sabbath should be a full day. That's another topic. Because the Sabbath as a whole day requires us to look into a different tradition, a tradition of rituals, and how that has become a ritual for some religious traditions like Judaism and some parts of Christianity, but that's not part of our Presbyterian tradition. So how do we do that with authenticity is a big question. But because also in those narratives, the kairos, the time of God, cannot be measured by just hours, days. It can be a Sabbath of a month, it can be of a week, but it can be those single moments where you resist the temptation to be consumed by the busyness of a culture that is asking you to belong to things rather than belong to God. So, one of the most important pedagogical projects to engage as religious educators is both to perform the Sabbath ourselves so that we can gain some insight into the values of practicing it, and to train people to engage Sabbath practices that are self-restorative and transformative. The first thing that we have to, I would say, resist is idea that the time is limited for us. Because if we take the Sabbath then as a priority, the other things are the ones who have to be accommodated. I also provided you a journal. This is a practice. Again, there's so many ways to do that. And the thing about Sabbath, I find in this cathedral in time, is that what evokes and inspires in you a relationship with God is different from what it inspires me. So I don't like to come here with a recipe. I know you can go to a workshop or somebody else that will tell you, the 20 ways you implement Sabbath. Well, that will not be me. But I give you another tool that I have with, I use with pastors who participate of a retreat where they go by themselves, they rest, and I ask them to journal. If they take those pauses, either by napping, by reading, by just sitting down and just praying, by taking a walk during the day at certain times, take notes on that. Journal first, discern. How does that really change you? Napping may be helpful for some people. For other people, it can create anxiety because that's not Sabbath. So there's no rule for the Sabbath. So take notes in the sermon. Use that sheet that I provided to take notes. How do I feel physically after engaging this activity? How do I feel emotionally? And once you find those things that really touch you, because you find those to be meaningful and to energize you, then you can put together a plan to follow those through in a more systematic way. Okay, so just to finish, because we are at our end, this is the blessing of practicing the Sabbath. The blessing of Sabbath for us Christians is that the many labors of our ministry and our many attempts to achieve personal fulfillment can turn momentary satisfaction into a drowning sea of anxiety. Yes, we can be satisfied with the things that we do in ministry, but it can really drown you into a sea of anxiety. And just a moment with God, an intentional, deliberate moment with God, may be life-saving. And my blessing, or the Sabbath, before it was the blessing of Sabbath, and now for you, a Sabbath blessing. Like God, let us trust that the world will hold. Like God, let us enjoy the order and rhythms of creation. Like God, let's be at rest and at peace with the plenty. Let us find ourselves able to bask in God's reliable goodness, unanxious, unafraid, unbothered, free, transformed, and redeemed. Amen. Friends, I will stay here because I know I have ideas I need to share with you to give you food for thought. I know if you wanted something more practical or ideas, you probably may need a more extended conversation. So I will stay here. If you want to stay and open your mic and ask me questions, the rest of you have a blessed day. And please find those moments of disruption. Once you feel that you're too busy, stop, pause, contract, and seek that energizing center that gives meaning to your life to go on. Peace be with you. And if you want to stay, I will open now, close here, and then you can ask me any question. 10 minutes, okay? Escape here.
I have a question.
Yes, let me
Wait.
close this so that I can see you and then we can see you. Stop share. I say stop share. Okay, anyhow. Okay, yes, question.
I'm just wondering if you see Sabbath more as a Sunday thing or something to incorporate through the rest of the week.
What I'm saying is it should not be, if it's a Sabbath, it's a Sunday thing, then it will be defined by time. And it will not be, it will be defined by space, sorry. We do this in this day, it becomes ritualized, so there's no newness to it. There's no sense of awe because we're doing the same thing, because we're consuming ourselves with work and concerns about time. But certainly people can then, if they don't have time during the week, they can make, for example, a plan to make Sunday, for example, after worship, to during the day engage some of those practices. So I get it can be the opportunity, like a starting point to a Sabbath practice, but it cannot be centered just on that. Okay. Any other question? Those are, I know people were concerned and said they won't find time, they want to. No? Okay. Jan, no question. Anne, Brooke. Oh, Anne left. Okay. Amy. And you can take time to think. No problem.
Do you find it helpful to have the same practice that you do each time, or try different things?
Yeah, for some time, because this is the good thing about practices. What I consider to be, again, the sole day that sometimes we don't have the luxury, that's another topic. But having the moments themselves, I think they create habits because they're so unusual that then in your memory grasp, like during the day, you say like, yes, I broke my day and had a Sabbath moment because I remember what happened there. So you do that, and then for some time until it becomes a habit, and then probably you need something new to invigorate yourself and your relationship with God. And this sounds crazy, and this is good that there's a small group here. But for example, when I take a shower, for some, not every day, but sometimes I'm very conscious when I go in and say like, you know that when you take a shower, you're always thinking about what you're gonna do after you finish. Oh, I have to go to the supermarket. I have to do this. I have to do this. So I, rather than occupy my mind with that, that's honestly my remembrance of baptism. I just get there and just the water, and my focus is just water, just water, just water. Following that, and what I discovered, and I have no intention for that, meaning I don't want to learn anything from it. And what I discovered the other day, surprisingly, was when I went out, I wasn't thinking about work. And I have one of the best ideas I have about work immediately. I said like, wow, this is interesting. But I wasn't there to think about work. I just wanted just to feel the water and to feel that and then remind myself of the baptism. Sometimes, for example, I ask 4 of my friends who are pastors to send me a prayer, a small one, every morning. So I take that, I print it, I take it in my pocket, I say every 4 hours, like medicine. This is going to be my medicine today. Every 4 hours, I take it out, I pray the prayer, Even if I cease to do that, I will remember that and what I learned later.
I like that. Very
Because
simple. That makes it very, very simple. It's not-
Very simple. And what happens is that then when you have the opportunity to take the day, which will be ideal, then you have things that you can do that will not take you into different places. Because that's what happened too. Many pastors take Sabbaths and they go into the routine of saying like, okay, I'm going to take it. I don't have the work of the church, but I'm going to be thinking about how do I do this better? But that's not the point. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This
You're
has been
welcome.
very helpful.
Well, okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye. Thank you. Thank you for staying.